This is Emily O'Reilly, the EU Ombudsman. And you're from Ireland. You've been a journalist in the past. You've written a couple of books. You're also Ireland's first female ombudsman as well. So you were first elected as an EU ombudsman in 2013, if I'm correct. And you're
10 years ago.
10 years ago now.
This week.
Wow, yeah. This week. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And since you've been re-elected as well. So first of all, what is the role of the EU Ombudsman within the EU?
Okay, well, most people would be familiar with the Ombudsman in the Member States. Obviously, we have an Irish Ombudsman. I was that person once upon a time. And so it's basically if people feel they haven't been treated well, fairly, legally by the public administration, they can make a complaint to the Ombudsman investigates and then makes a recommendation. So at home, most of the Ombudsman in the Member States are dealing with sort of bread and butter issues. So it'd be housing, education, grants, benefits, all that sort of stuff. Here it's slightly different because most of those issues are the competence of the Member State. So here, if people have an issue with the European Commission, for example, in relation to grants and benefits and so on, they can come to us. If they're looking for information from one of the big regulatory agencies, such as, for example, the European Medicines Agency or the European Banking Authority, and they don't get that information, they can come to us. If you're an NGO and you're concerned about migration, for example, and what's happening in the Mediterranean, you have a complaint, let's say, against Frontex, which is the Border Protection Agency, you don't get satisfaction, you can come to us. And obviously, as you probably know, Brussels is a big lobbying centre. So a lot of civil society organisations follow the lobbyists, and if they feel that there are issues around revolving doors, when officials go into the private sector, or if there are issues around conflicts of interest, they can make a complaint to us as well. So it covers a wide range. So it's basically around are people being treated fairly? Is the European administration, all the bodies, agencies and institutions doing what they're supposed to be doing? And if they think they're not, they can come to us and we'll try and resolve the problem.
Wow, so a very extensive role you have, I guess, covering all, not only the institutions, but all the agencies as well. So
yes, the entire administration, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So talking about this administration, obviously it is very vast administration. A lot of people say that the EU is maybe bureaucratic in a way or stuff like this. So can you tell us a bit more about how the EU works and if you think it's democratic and representative?
Okay. Well, of course it's bureaucratic. It has to be bureaucratic. I mean, you're trying to deal with 27 different member states and all of that. So necessarily there has to be a certain order. Our role is to make it as accountable as possible, to make it as transparent as possible. Because, so you're Irish and you generally know what the government is doing and what the public administration is up to and you feel close to them. Mm-hmm. People don't feel close to Brussels, Brussels is sort of like a state of mind and people feel slightly even alienated from it. But Brussels makes hugely important decisions that affect all of our lives. And so you have to make that as open and as transparent and as understandable to people as their own administrations would be. So that's part of the work we do, sort of acting as a bridge between the citizen and the administration itself.
Mm-hmm. And obviously that's your work is to make it more transparent, but as it is, does it look like to many citizens, especially young people, it does seem like this maybe undemocratic at times because only one of the bodies is elected directly by the citizens. So how does democracy function within the institutions?
Yeah, well, I suppose, okay, you're right, the Parliament is directly elected. Then the commissioners are chosen by the member states and ultimately appointed by the Parliament and so on. And then the Council is all the ministers that we send over. So in that sense, there is accountability back to the member states. But obviously there's criticism when, for example, the Commission President is not directly elected, though there have been attempts over the last couple of elections to have a thing called a Spitzenkandidaten, whereby certain politicians are put forward by the groups to be the Commission President, and if those groups win the most votes in the European elections, then their candidate should be the President of the Commission. Now that hasn't worked so far because the member states want to retain control of that. But anything that happens in Brussels, in Europe, tends to happen slowly. And I think the more people become engaged with Brussels and the more there are concerns around democratic political legitimacy, democratic accountability, all of that, I think we will see changes over the next while. But, you know, it can be a slow process. One has to be patient.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Spitzenkandidaten process. Do you think that it will be maybe utilised in this next election, or do you think it should be as well? Is it a good process?
Well, to my mind, I mean, I don't have a particular view. Whatever works, whatever is the most democratic. I mean, there have been, you know, attempts to make the European elections and therefore the appointments of the senior figures then to have it more on a kind of a European-wide basis instead of little deals being worked out behind closed doors, as a lot of people would see. From what I've read, I don't have any more particular insight into it than you do. I can't see it happening this time. A lot depends, of course, on to a degree, it depends on what happens in the European elections, the balance of power and so on, whether it's centre-right, whether it's more left, green, whatever. We'll see. At the moment, we see across Europe a lot of more the centre-right, right-wing parties emerging in various countries. Is that going to impact on the European elections? Possibly. What will that mean in terms of the Spitzenkandidaten process or democracy generally? You know, we will await developments.
Yeah, thank you. So a bit more on this trust that we've been talking about. A recent UN report showed that worldwide 76% of young people don't trust political institutions. So how has the EU come to this challenge, has met this challenge, and how does your office help build trust in the EU and the institutions?
Well, I think the first thing people have to do is to realise why they're there. You know, they're there to serve citizens, not themselves. And what do citizens want? I mean, I don't think most citizens wake up every morning worrying about the future of Europe. They worry about the future of their young people. They worry about their mortgages. They worry about inflation. They worry about those things. And when they see the institutions, whether the European institutions or the member state institutions, actively working on those issues of critical importance to people and families, that's when trust will grow.
And how does the Ombudsman Office, I know you work a lot on transparency, how does this contribute to building the trust within the institutions?
Well, I mean, we attempt to have, the Council in particular, I mean, the Parliament is reasonably transparent because they debate in public and you can watch it and they have their committees and all of that. So there's a great deal of transparency in the Parliament. But relative to the Council are where, you know, our ministers and their ministers and come to Brussels and get into a huddle and decide on important legislation. And I mean, it has been called even by other institutions as the black box because we don't know. I mean, do we know how position Ireland is taking, for example, on a particular issue? No. Well, maybe if we ask them, yes. But I mean, a lot of these things are not proactively disclosed. So, and deals are done. So, I mean, you could have a situation where country A favours a particular proposal, needs an alliance, so it talks to country B and country C. Well, if you support me on this, I'll support you on that, and blah 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 blah. So those are the things that are not transparent. And I mean, the argument that's put to us is, look, oh, for God's sake, you know, if you try and get 3 people to agree over what to have for dinner, can you imagine get 27 member states to agree on something, and so it has to be done behind closed doors, and I get that to a point. You know, there has to be this space for deliberation, the space to think, and I absolutely understand that. But at a certain point, people need to know. So you have a situation whereby, let's say you were trying to find out a position that Ireland took on a particular proposal, I don't know. And if you looked at the minutes or if you looked at, you know, the agendas or whatever, instead of seeing Ireland voted this way, Spain, blah, 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 you would see a group of countries agreed or a group of countries didn't agree. So it's opaque. You see, the Council hasn't really sort of fails to see itself as primarily a legislative body. It still sees itself in that diplomatic role, you know, secrecy and behind closed doors and deals and all of that. But it is in the same legislative space as the Parliament, and therefore it needs to be as open and as transparent. So we've done a lot of work on that, and we have opened it up. I mean, there are things called, I don't know whether you've been in Brussels long enough to hear about trilogues, but trilogues are the informal negotiations between the Commission that proposes a regulation and then the Parliament and the Council who have to agree it between them. And when I arrived about 10 years ago, everybody was talking about trilogues. I'd never heard of trilogues before because the word trilogue doesn't even exist in legislation or the treaties. It's an informal word. And so you didn't know where they were going on, you didn't know when they were going on, you didn't know who was taking part in them. So over time, we have made those, we have encouraged the Council to make those steps. So now people generally will know where the trilogues are going on, what's being discussed, who's involved in them, and then then it depending on the regulation, the compromises that are being made. Things that are sensitive are less transparent. So it's been slow, but I mean we have made progress.
Okay, yeah, that's very good. And in the progress that you're making, I know you're working on lots of different areas at the moment. Is there anything that might be of particular interest to young people?
We did handle a complaint a few years ago about, it was a complaint from somebody who had worked as a stagiaire, as an intern in the EACEA, the European External Action Service, which is basically the foreign service of the EU, and the stagiaire were not paid. So you had to have a little bit of money from mummy and daddy or somebody else if you wanted to take up this, very good sort of tick on your CV. And so it was it was a question of privilege. It was money following money. So if you had the money or your parents had the money to enable you to live in Brussels or wherever and take up the stagiaire, then you were ahead of somebody else. Maybe just as bright, as intelligent, as, ambitious, but you just didn't have the money. So anyway, as a result of the work we did, stagiaires are now paid. So that was one thing we did. We're also working a lot on climate, and I mean that is something that's going to affect you lot more than us lot who'd be, long gone. Well, maybe not that long gone by the time the climate crisis really comes to a head. Although I notice even in recent weeks, I mean, didn't we experience recently the hottest day ever?
History,
So we're monitoring that a lot in terms of lobbying. I mean, we did a case, for example, a couple of years ago involving BlackRock, which is one of the world's biggest investment company, and a lot of its clients invest in the fossil fuel industry, and they'd been awarded a contract by the European Commission to look into the environmental, social, and government issues around ethical banking, ESG. Yeah. So, in other words, so you want to invest in an ethical project, and what are the investment rules around it? How should banks deal with that to enable it to happen without causing too much risk? So we got a complaint claiming that there's a conflict of interest here, that BlackRock, on the one hand was, working with people or helping people to invest in fossil fuel industry, on the other hand it was on the other side of the fence in relation to the environmental issue. We didn't find maladministration because we found that the officials who were working on it were looking at correctly interpreted the conflict of interest rules. We just said the conflict of interest rules are way too narrow. They don't encompass this. Conflict of interest, well, my brother's an accountant in the same firm or something like that, but it wasn't the wider piece. And we made the point to the Commission, you can't, sort of have this wonderful, ambitious agenda about the environment out there and then these small things. So as a result of that, the new financial regulation is going to have a different a new conflict of interest regulation, which will be wider and which hopefully would deal like issues such as that. So, it's not absolutely directly linked to young people, but as far as I'm concerned, everything to do with climate is going to have an huge impact on your generation.
Yeah. And to come back to this piece on the stagiaires as well, I know, for example, the European Youth Forum has been campaigning strongly over the last couple of years to ban unpaid internships within the European Union, and I know recently the Parliament passed an own initiative report calling for more regulation and to ban unpaid internships. And there is some favour within the Commission. Commissioner Schmidt is looking favourably on it as well. So what is your position on this? I know you fought for stagiaires just within the institutions, but in the broader context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it goes to one of the high values of the treaty, which is non-discrimination. And if you can get a stagiaire or a traineeship because you can afford to stay for free in Brussels, or you can afford to stay in Brussels, and somebody else can't, then that's discrimination. And I think that there absolutely has to be equal opportunity. That finance shouldn't be a barrier to young people taking up internships in Brussels. So I mean, I think the work that we did with WES, I mean, I think that changed that changed the situation in other agencies as well, but it needs to be obviously more widespread.
So yes, coming back to this piece, we talked about how young people might not trust institutions, but there's some other aspects as well. What steps do you think that the European Union can take to address the apathy towards politics that some young people may have? Some young people feel maybe disconnected or disillusioned by the democratic process. How should the EU and the institutions, specifically maybe the Parliament, look to target this young voting bloc that might maybe feel apathetic towards this?
Well, I mean, I think it has to talk to them for a start. It has to not just pay lip service to young people, but actively involve them in legislation, whatever. If they're doing consultations in relation to particular pieces of legislation that will have an impact on young people, we'll talk to young people. They're the ones who are going to be experiencing it. Recently, we had our European Ombudsman Awards for Good Administration, and one of the prizes was given, I think, to the Commission who had engaged with very young people in relation to a piece of legislation involving children. And like when I saw the entry come in first, I thought, well, is this really cosmetic, But no, they did. They actually actively engaged with the young people and met with them and engaged with them and really took what they were saying on board. So that needs to happen. But I mean, I think people sometimes make the mistake of thinking that the EU is Brussels. Everything has to come from Brussels. The EU is also Dublin and Bratislava and every other capital city and town and region. So member state governments also have a huge role to play in engaging with young people. And I mean, there was the European Citizens Initiative, you may recall, came out of one of the treaties about, it must be about 10 or 11, longer now, quite a while ago. And this was intended that if 1 million signatures were secured from citizens from, I think, 7 different member states, then a proposal could be put to the Commission in relation to some proposal. That hasn't worked well. There's been a kind of an apathy about it, and I think that was a pity because that was an opportunity to really get young people engaged, because a lot of young people did get engaged, and it's a huge thing to have to do, gathering all those signatures and all of that, and if they're not going to see results at the end. So it's not paying lip service to young people, and it's also, I think people are becoming a lot more acutely conscious of it, that when older people talk about the climate crisis is really going to impact, and I see young people now, I mean, I've a few young people myself, and decisions that they're making about their futures are being impacted by how they consider the climate crisis, I mean, you hear about young people maybe deciding in the future not to have children, and that's sad, and that's, and then I was just reading a piece this morning, this isn't specific, well, it is about young people, though not necessarily in Europe. So many of the refugees who are coming, trying to get into Europe are fleeing climate crisis events, the flooding in Pakistan. I mean, there's so many of those poor people who drowned a few weeks ago were fleeing, climate catastrophe events. I mean, the whole, the Syrian piece many years ago started from people, whose, crops had died out because of water shortages in the countryside in rural Syria, and were coming into the cities and weren't being able to find work. And so the whole thing, you can't hermetically seal off any of these things, So, that is why, to me, it is the single greatest, crisis for the EU, and not just about and for young people, and therefore, young people really need to get actively engaged, but the older people also need actively to engage with young people as well.
Yeah, because there is a lot of active lobbying with many organisations, young youth organisations based on climate, and we've seen them over the last couple of years even more intensely lobbying for climate action, but there's still this lack of actual maybe representation in political spaces. We see also that 30% of Europe's population is under 30, yet we only see 6 MEPs in the European Parliament that are under 30 at the moment. So
what age are you?
Well, I'm 20 at the moment.
Okay. Are you old enough to be a candidate?
Not in every country. There's countries again that limit the candidates at 21, or that have to be 24.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, you notice that. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think increasingly young people are going to get involved, if only because the older people aren't exactly we're making a bit of a mess of it in some places, and it's much more urgent for the young people. But also young people as well, in fairness. I mean, they find sometimes their voices are better heard and they get more outcomes for their work if they're activists. I mean, okay, famously Greta, and what she did and how, the impact that has had. And some people find that they have more impact through activism and all of that than through the political route, which can be slower. But you need it in both, because ultimately it'll be the politicians that are making the regulations influenced by the activism of the NGOs and civil society.
But do you think there's maybe systemic discrimination against young people within the political sphere? Because I think there's only some parties that do maybe put young candidates on their lists for elections nationally and European-wise.
Well, speaking as a woman against whom there was much systemic discrimination in politics, I don't mean me personally, but I mean, women. I mean, we still struggle to be adequately represented in Parliament, and Ireland is not a shining example of that. Other countries are. So yeah, you can see it in young people, because what people have, they hold. And the people who have tended to be older males, and they want to hang on to that power base. Now, in fairness to Ireland and other countries, they've given incentives, financial incentives for parties to put forward more people as candidates. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily emerge, but there have been efforts certainly in relation to women, so I don't see why the same efforts can't be made in relation to young people. And of course, young people have the advantage of being so social media savvy, I mean, you guys can attract, interest and votes and whatever in ways that older generations could not and still possibly can't, so there are opportunities there.
Mm-hmm. And on the other side of the democratic process as well, we have the people who are voting. And I know in some European countries, for example, Belgium and Germany, this will be the first time that 16 and 17-year-olds can vote in European elections. So we are seeing this move towards lowering the voting age. Do you think this is positive, will have a positive impact for young people? Do you think it should be adopted more widely across the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was put forward for European elections and then nixed by the member states because, they said, well, it should be the same as the member state thing. I personally, I'm not speaking as Ombudsman. Yeah, why not? I mean, we see sometimes the sort of people that older people can elect, so I don't think the 16-year-olds can do any worse, really.
Fair enough. So my last question that I'm going to ask is about quite a big scandal we've seen in the past year that a lot of people refer to as Qatargate. So there was this corruption scandal in the European Parliament just last October or last
December, actually.
December, sorry. Yeah. So after Qatargate, we've seen a lot of different ideas for reforms within the European Parliament come out. You've mentioned in your report that the Parliament needs to deliver on these promises of reforms. Some are calling for more transparency in lobbying, some are calling for tougher scrutiny on non-governmental organisations. What do you think is maybe the right approach to this reform?
Well, I mean, I think you have to start from the top. What do we want? We want an administration, we want a Parliament, we want a Commission, we want a Council that isn't inappropriately influenced by outside interests, that the public interest is always there. And I think I've made the point a few times that since Qatargate, because it was such an interesting scandal, a lot of people knew about it, read about it, and a lot of people have become a lot more literate in relation to what a good ethics regime should be. And it's very simple. It needs to be independent. It needs to have the powers to investigate, and it needs to have the powers to impose sanctions or at least suggest sanctions. And if those elements aren't there, then it's not worth it. So we've seen lots of ideas and lots of proposals come from the Parliament and so on. Let's see what emerges in the end. At the moment, I mean, look, at the heart of this is politics. And it's the same split. You see the left and the Greens and whatever in favour of greater regulation and so on, and you see the centre-right and the right not so much. So it's who wins that battle. So you've seen proposals put forward. For example, there was going to be a 2-year cooling off period for MEPs once they left their jobs before they could lobby effectively. That was reduced to 6 months. That was politics, We have made the case that the advisory body in Parliament, which comprises 6 MEPs and which decides on alleged breaches of the code, and then it's the Parliament President who ultimately decides on sanctions, that needs to be given the power of own initiative investigation. In other words, it has to be told to investigate something. Let's say if it reads something or hears something, it can't of its own initiative investigate something. And then it can only, it makes a recommendation to the President, but, that's as far as it goes. So to me at the moment, it's weak. And we have suggested that it should be given proactive powers, and it should be widened in terms of bringing in more independent experts. If that happens, fine, they'll have made a step, an important step. If it doesn't happen, then, politics have won out. Certain politics have won out.
And because I know some of the parties or the political groups within the Parliament have called for this scrutiny on non-governmental organisations as well as maybe a source of the problem. What's your opinion on that approach or that?
Well, I mean, people shouldn't use this as an excuse to kick NGOs or civil society activists who are, because they don't particularly like what they're being active about. But I do think that, everybody should be transparent. If NGOs are funded, then there's no reason why we shouldn't know about that. But, you can see it being, that issue being politicised, and because there was an NGO at the centre of Cattergate, as I said, it was a fake NGO, so let's separate out the fake NGOs from the people who do their work very conscientiously and in the spirit of public service and so on, and let's not use this to abuse civil society, while at the same time acknowledging that civil society also has an obligation to be as transparent as possible.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, for taking the interview and for giving us such really interesting insights into the work that you do and into the world of transparency within the institutions.
You're more than welcome.